Welcome to the Curiosity Center, where we offer more questions than answers. So today's question is, what if the future of digital storage isn't in silicon chips, but inside our very own cells? We have been saving data on hard drives, flash disks, and cloud servers, but all these have limits. What if nature already designed a far superior system billions of years ago? Today we are looking at DNA, not as a molecule of life, but as a storage device. You know what? Let's talk about it. What is up, everybody? This is Marvin, and so today we are going to talk about DNA as a data storage. So before we actually go into the nitty-gritties of DNA, we have to look at the different data storages or storage media that we have actually possessed throughout history. And I would like to say that the first storage medium that we have ever possessed is our own brain, our own natural memory. Because we realized that initially the only way we actually kept and stored information was through telling it to another person, and that person storing it in their brain and then transferring that information from generation to generation. And that's how we actually have some legends and stories have persisted. It is through utilizing our brain as a storage medium. However, as you can already tell, our brain is really terrible at storing information due to a bunch of reasons, and I think one of the reasons is a phenomenon known as the game of telephone, whereby if I actually say a phrase to person 1, by the time it reaches person 100, it would have changed and maybe even be completely different from what I actually said to person 1. So that can easily affect that. As a story is or information is transferred from person to person, it gets diluted, and its core meaning tends to get lost through this transmission medium. So our natural brain, much as it being really strong and powerful, it's very unreliable. So I think that's where we can actually go to writing, whereby I think writing was really revolutionary, because the moment we started exporting information onto external media, that actually changed everything, because now we don't have to bank on the unreliability of our brains, but now we can actually keep it there, and it doesn't matter what you actually think about the information. The fact that the information is there is enough to actually prove to us that this is the actual information, because it doesn't change. Once it's written down, it is written down. And that's how actually a part of our history is identified, is through some of the surviving written media that was written by people hundreds and even thousands of years ago. Yeah, so it was really revolutionary. So in our current generation and current century, what is the current mode of storing information? I think we all know at the moment we are using storage media like compact discs known as CDs, magnetic tapes, SSDs known as the solid state devices. However, one thing you have to note about these, they have their own challenges. Just like how our brain has the challenge of unreliability, that information can easily be diluted the more it gets transmitted. I think also our current media has challenges. First of all, it's temporary. That, for example, hard drives last about 5 to 10 years. DVDs may be about 50 years at best. Right? So this is one of the limitations, that yes, we keep this data reliably on drives, but these drives have limitations that once like 5 years pass by, 10 years, you are most likely going to lose a lot of this information. And also it has its own challenges, that it could easily get corrupted, like viruses, or maybe any mistake you accidentally throw it in water. What happens? All the terabytes of information that you may have had on that device will get lost just by a slight mistake. So it is very fragile also. So that's why we have to be extra careful on storing it in one or the other. So a lot of our data is stored in what we call data centers. I think you're aware that every time you say that I've actually backed up my data on the cloud is essentially physical data centers that a lot of these trillion-dollar companies possess. However, one thing you have noted, most especially with this AI boom, that a lot of these data centers actually require a massive amount of electricity in order to operate, and they generate a lot of heat. So massive amount of water is also needed to cool a bunch of these systems. So you realize that we have serious wastage of resources in the process. And also another interesting point to note is humanity's total data is doubling roughly every 2 years, and we are running out of efficient ways to store it. So just imagine that it's exponentially rising, but the tools that we have can only store so much data. And again, these tools are also unreliable in their own ways that we have previously mentioned. Yeah, so it is something very interesting to actually think about the current storage media we have. Like, global data creation is expected to exceed over 180 zettabytes. That is about, like 1 zettabyte is a billion terabytes. So just imagine 180 zettabytes are expected to be exceeded, right? So just imagine that 180 zettabytes means more data centers are needed. And since data storage is actually doubling, or the total data that we actually possess is doubling, that can be catastrophic, right? Because cloud storage is not as infinite as some people may think, because it's just, cloud storage is just somebody else's computer somewhere else. Most of it's computers held by these trillion-dollar companies. So they can only store so much data. So it's something that we have to look at. So now, with that in mind, now let's go into our main topic, DNA. Can DNA be actually a good replacement for our current drives to store data? For those who may be wondering, DNA, wait, are you actually meaning like the DNA that makes up human life, like the one that we have in our bodies and other organisms that exist in the world? Yes, that's the DNA I'm talking about. Because one thing you have to note is that DNA is one of, I think it's the de facto storage medium. It's the nature's storage medium. Because one interesting thing about DNA is that DNA has actually managed to successfully store a lot of information. For example, all the information of your ancestors in your lineage actually exists in your current DNA. That is why we can be able even to trace your ancestry. We can know who your mother, we can know who your father is, based on what? Based on the data stored in DNA. And this data has been stored for millions of years. So that's how even a lot of great discoveries that we actually know, we have tapped DNA that has managed to be perfectly stored for millions of years. And this data still exists. There is no device that we know that can store data for millions of years, right? So this DNA stores a lot of these instructions of life, the billions of these components, because DNA can be categorized into 4 bases, the A, T, C, and G. So a lot of these billions of letters are actually stored in this DNA and can persist for millions of years, provided the conditions in which it's stored are good enough to keep it from deteriorating, right? Yeah, so this is one thing you have to know, that DNA is actually really a good storage medium. It is really a good storage medium that the people that have actually explored it have actually found out a few interesting discoveries. For example, all of the information to make a human fits into a few gigabytes, yet it encodes entire organisms. Just imagine that all the information that is required to make a human being is just a few gigabytes, right? That's one thing. Then another thing you have to know is that DNA can theoretically store 215 petabytes per gram. Like for each gram of DNA, it can store 215 petabytes. Remember, we talked about zettabytes, which is a billion terabytes. Petabytes are a billion zettabytes. So, can you imagine? It can store 215 of that in each gram. Just a gram of DNA can store 215 petabytes. That is exponentially like a massive amount of data that 1 gram of DNA can store, and that's 1 gram, right? So that is one thing you have to also put into mind, that DNA is actually a strong and powerful storage medium. But then a person may ask, why haven't we used it? Okay, if it's as powerful as you actually mentioned, why aren't we using it? Why haven't we replaced our current storage medium? We are going to answer that question. Just keep listening to this podcast. So the another thing that we have also actually have to also note is that yes, we have identified that DNA can store data, but the person may ask, how does it do it? So DNA stores data in this given format. The first thing is that we all know, I think we are all aware that our current digital information is stored in zeros and ones, right? And for those who are not familiar, let me know if I could actually talk about it in an episode. So our computer information is stored in zeros and ones. So what happens at first is we get this binary data, which is in zeros and ones, and we convert it into the 4 DNA bases, the A, T, C, and G that I talked about previously, that DNA is actually made up of 4 bases, A, and the assigned letters A, T, C, and G. So at first we get our binary data converted into these 4 bases, which is doable because we do conversion all the time. So converting binary data to A, T, C, and G is doable. Then after that, a machine which is known as a DNA synthesizer writes the sequence as actual DNA strands. So these DNA strands are actually known as oligos, okay? And now writes actual DNA strands known as oligos. It writes many of them. After doing that, so now these DNA strands that have actually been created can now be read back using sequencing technology into data, and then that data can be interpreted by the software as digital information once again. So you realize that binary data converted into DNA bases A, T, C, and G, then a DNA synthesizer synthesizes these converted DNA bases into DNA strands. Then these strands can later be sequenced back into data, which can be reinterpreted back into digital information. So that is a doable process and it has been actually demonstrated. I think the biggest challenge so far that we have is the second point, the DNA synthesizer. This is where the problem is, that converting binary data to DNA bases is easy, but the challenge is synthesizing it, creating these many DNA strands. This is where a lot of costs are actually incurred. And so once this number 2 problem is solved, then DNA can actually be easily adoptable. Not like to be used in your smartphone, but like us, be used like in real world cases. Here are some very interesting insights that I actually found out. In 2012, Harvard geneticist George Church encoded a book, images, and even a JavaScript program into DNA. In 2017, Microsoft and the University of Washington stored 200 megabytes of data, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a music video. DNA storage has been used to encode the Mona Lisa and even an operating system. So with these examples, you actually note that, yes, this process has been actually demonstrated in real life. So there is a proof of concept. But a person may say, wait, they only store 200 megabytes of data. Like that's like literally, that's small data. But one thing you have to note, that's a great achievement, because there was a point in time in 2012 when George Church wrote his paper. This thing was technically just a concept. Nobody would actually think that this thing would be done. So the fact that 200 megabytes of data are encoded, that is actually progress. So if this is demonstrated, that means if we reduce the costs on the synthesization of DNA, which I told you is, I think, the most straining process, if we look for ways of actually reducing those costs, this process, the storage of data, can increase from 200 MBs to 2 GB, 200 GB, 2 TB, and so on. And once that happens, then DNA can easily be adopted. So, another thing we have to note now, a person now may be wondering, like, why DNA? Like, can't we think of other methods of storing data? Why do we need to consider DNA? One thing you have to know about DNA is, first of all, it's very durable. That DNA can last tens of thousands of years if kept in cool, dry conditions. This is something I've talked about previously, that there's a lot of genetic information that we have discovered from DNA that was millions of years old. There is no device that we know that can potentially store information for millions of years. DNA can. So once we keep it in cool and dry conditions, DNA can do that, right? Yes, like this is actually in my notes. Scientists have read DNA from mammoths, Neanderthals, and even plants millions of years ago. So this is the power, that if DNA can be a storage medium, it beats all these other media that we know, right? Then another thing about DNA is the density. This is also something I've talked about, that initially that I talked about, like 1 gram of DNA can store 215 petabytes of data. That is a big deal, guys. That is a big deal. Like, that means the whole internet, the whole information on the internet does not even fit that. The whole information of internet is about, I've not thought about it, but one thing you have to know, like, all Google's data centers could theoretically fit in a shoebox if stored in DNA form, right? All Google's data centers, we are talking about Google, all Google's data centers could theoretically fit in a shoebox if stored in DNA form. So this is the density we are talking about, that it's durable, it can last for thousands of years, millions potentially, and it's very dense. A lot of information can be fixed in a small amount of DNA. Then also energy efficiency. DNA storage requires no power once encoded. This is interesting, but again, I've said it's very expensive. I think the expense is in synthesizing, the process of storing the data. This is where the expense is. But the moment the data is stored, no extra costs. Unlike the current drives that right now, a lot of the data that is being stored in these data centers is actually using high amount of electricity, yet it's just already stored. So imagine DNA, once we store it, no usage of what? It's just like writing quoted in a book. Most of the energy comes in outputting the knowledge from your head to the book. The moment you do that, no more extra energy is required in storing the data in the book. So that's the same way DNA works, that most of the costs are coming from the process of storing the data, but the moment the data is stored, no extra power is required. So this is a very interesting It's a very interesting insight. So imagine if DNA is used as like an archival storage, like a museum of data, whereby we store our data, we like sacrifice the initial costs, but the moment we store it, we keep it in a safe location, because we know it's not going to consume extra power, but the data is saved on this DNA stored somewhere, right? So that is actually a very interesting thing. So I mentioned previously that DNA is really powerful, but why isn't it like a big thing right now? Because if it was as a big deal as I said, Why aren't we using it? I think I've literally mentioned many of the reasons why it's not yet adopted. First of all, it's really expensive and slow. Again, after the process of storing this data is very expensive. It takes, for example, like encoding 1 megabyte of data costs hundreds of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to do what? To store 1 megabyte of data. So that is a lot of what? That is a lot of money. That's why I've told you, when Microsoft actually successfully stored 200 megabytes, that was a big deal because that is a lot of money that they actually used to make that happen, right? So that's one thing, a big challenge that we are facing. Then another challenge that I think it's facing is the errors. It still has some errors during the encoding process that they need to overcome. Once that process is also overcome, I think this could be something that is worth looking into, right? So yes, DNA as a data storage is something potential and can be useful. It may not be used in your smartphone, laptop, or what. And I don't think that is even the direction I'm taking. I think the goal is at least for it to replace certain data centers, because these guys are actually consuming a lot of electricity and a lot of water, since they require a lot of energy to keep operating, and they generate a lot of heat since they use a lot of energy. So DNA can actually overcome that hurdle. The moment we actually look for ways of minimizing the costs of the process of storing this data onto DNA, I think it can be a seriously usable product, right? So now, what does that mean for the future? These are a few things to think about. Actually, some alternative use cases I've thought about for DNA. What if we actually store some data on the DNA and place it into biological systems? What about that? Have we thought about that? It's just a thought experiment. Elon Musk is currently making Neuralink. So what if, after creating this chip, the world's data is stored on this DNA and incorporated into this chip, Neuralink chip, placed into your brain, and you have access to the world's data, world's information? Is that a good or bad thing? I know at the moment I'm not thinking about the moral implications, but the technological use cases. Is it something possible or not? Is it ethical or not? That is something we can think about. It is something I've actually just thought of right now. Is it possible to do? Is it not? Is it a good idea or not? We can think about that. So that is one thing. Then also another very interesting aspect is what if DNA was actually already used as a storage device by some ancient civilization that we don't know about? Yes, ancient civilization. Because some people ask, ancient civilization, what do you mean? Because as far as we know, the only advanced ancient civilization that we know that is capable of storing data is our own. Yes, that is correct. However, have you thought about the idea that there could have been an extinct ancient civilization that we have no idea about and we don't have information about? Have we thought about that? In fact, episode 3 is actually talking about that same process, the Silurian hypothesis, which is the thought experiment that suggests that there could have been an advanced ancient civilization or advanced ancient civilizations that rose and fell. So watch out for episode 3. However, as I wrap up this episode, I would like to leave you with a few questions to think about while you're going to watch episode 3. Maybe the story of DNA was never just about evolution, it was about information all along. What if nature solved computing before humans have existed? And if life can store data for billions of years, maybe the universe is one giant library and we are only beginning to read the first page. You know what? Let's talk about it.